A few days ago, just before Thanksgiving, a 29-year-old Afghan national shot two National Guard soldiers in Washington, D.C. One of the soldiers died of her wounds, while the other remains in hospital with critical injuries. US President Donald Trump called the shooting an act of evil and vowed the shooter would pay the highest possible price. But what emerged in the hours and days after about the main suspect in the shooting was more complex than many commentators expected. It emerged that Rahmanullah Lakanwal had fought in the US-led war in Afghanistan, not with the Taliban against US forces, but alongside the CIA as part of the secretive Zero Unit. These were elite Afghan forces that were responsible for night raids across the country in which hundreds of civilians were killed and many others disappeared. That incident got me thinking about power and how power can hide itself, how powerful institutions like the CIA, or indeed powerful people, hide their tracks so effectively that hugely controversial events like the night raids are forgotten for years, until some shocking event, like the DC shooting, forces it back into the limelight. Many times, of course, a story like that will never come back into the limelight. The job of uncovering those tracks that those powerful institutions or people have tried so hard to keep covered typically falls in the first instance to investigative journalists, something we'll come to later in the conversation. And the DC shooting wasn't the only case this year, or even this month, that got me thinking about the ramifications of hidden power. We had, after all, a slew of additional revelations about the work of the late sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein, in which it transpired he had been working behind the scenes to connect some of the world's most powerful individuals away from official channels and away from public scrutiny. To discuss the causes and consequences of some of these hidden power structures, I invited two investigative journalists onto the podcast who know these stories intimately. Lynzy has worked extensively on Afghanistan, including for New Lines, but one of her best-known investigations is into the Zero Units and the night raids. In her 4-year investigation, Lynzy personally tallied over 400 civilian casualties of the night raids. She noted in her piece that after the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan in 2021, many members of the Zero Units were killed, while some were airlifted to the US, where these lethally trained men had been dispersed across the country. Many, in this completely alien environment, could not find work or a use for their skills. I also brought on Murtaza Hussain. Murtaza reports on national security and foreign affairs for Dropsite News. His recent reporting has uncovered just what we were talking about, how Jeffrey Epstein operated as a high-level fixer for state actors and intelligence networks, far beyond his notoriety as a sex offender. Drawing on leaked documents and insider accounts, Murtaza and his colleagues described Epstein's role in brokering secret security agreements, facilitating Israeli cyber weapons ventures, and maintaining back channels with intelligence-linked figures around the world. I'm Faisal Al Yafai. Here's this week's episode of The Lead. Murtaza, I wanted to start with you, and particularly with your recent series of investigations into Jeffrey Epstein. And I think most people are familiar with Epstein. They know about his sinister sex trafficking, especially of minors, for which he went to prison. And indeed, there were many powerful people involved in that story, but your investigations have revealed so much more about the nature of his work with powerful people. So I wonder if we could start by giving us a flavor of that.
Sure. So we have an ongoing series being published at Dropsite News about Epstein's ties to foreign governments and foreign intelligence agencies in particular. Faisal, as you mentioned, a lot of the story about Epstein so far has been focused on the victims of his sex trafficking, and rightly so, the very egregious crimes. But an aspect of him that has not been really touched on at all, and even in some ways seemingly skirted around, are the nature of his ties to very wealthy individuals around the world, but also these intelligence agencies and governments for whom he appeared to work as a power broker or a fixer of some sort at a very high and very influential level. So we've done about 6 stories so far based on this theme, and the stories are based on a large part a set of leaked emails between Epstein and former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. They were very close collaborators on various different issues. His relationship with Barack was known to the public beforehand, but the communications show that it went far beyond just business deals and things like that, but really entailed the two men cooperating to accomplish political goals. In this case, on behalf of the Israeli government, and in conjunction with American intelligence, Russian intelligence, in some cases, Israeli intelligence. Epstein was like a geopolitical free agent who did work for certain countries and for certain agencies. And these emails offer a glimpse into that. And at the same time as we have these emails, which were hacked by an anonymous group some years ago and then posted on a website called Distributed Denial Secrets, we have disclosures from the U.S. House Oversight Committee of certain things from Epstein's estate, like some emails from his estate and some of his calendars, redacted calendars, which they've released to date, which shed a little bit more light on Epstein's activities. But when you view the two in conjunction, the Barack emails, which no one really wanted ever to be released, they were released by a hacking group, and then these mandated releases from the government, they put together a picture of somebody who had very deep ties with intelligence agencies and governments. Just to give one illustrative example, a very senior Israeli military intelligence official lived at Epstein's home in New York for extended stretches of time. That was never really been disclosed or explained in any format before. Epstein also helped do things like help create back channels between the Israeli and Russian governments to help find a solution, an immediate solution to the Syrian conflict. He was helping promote Israeli security interests and intelligence-linked surveillance firms in Mongolia, in Cote d'Ivoire, other countries we're going to write about in future. So he was somebody who was deeply, deeply embedded in these networks of powerful people. And his sex trafficking, again, it's not to say it's not part of the story. It absolutely is a major part of the story. And also the question of whether he was blackmailing people is, I think, a legitimate question as well, too. But it's only one aspect of a much broader role that Epstein had played in global politics in the last 3 decades.
I mean, I think that is why a lot of people are so interested in what happened on the island and in his various homes, because it does seem to shine a light on the way that power seems to work in reality. So some of the things that you just talked about, the back channel between Israel and Russia, perhaps that makes a certain amount of sense if he has connections with Barack. But when you talk about the Ivory Coast, or you talk about Mongolia, like, what is a private American citizen doing, creating these back channels and trying to work out security arrangements with countries on the other side of the world?
There is a story which we're going to publish soon, and I can talk about it a little bit because some details of it were also quietly acknowledged in a New York Times story without really getting into unpacking why it's so important. But Epstein, in 2011, he set up a meeting between Chase Bank, or JP Morgan Chase, and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to discuss something. They didn't discuss, in the New York Times didn't actually disclose in the email what that was, in that story, what that discussion was about. But he set up a meeting between Netanyahu and the bank to discuss something. Who was Jeffrey Epstein to be the person to set up such a meeting? Why would they need Jeffrey Epstein to set up a meeting with Netanyahu? How is he able to do that? That part of the story has never been explained to anybody. And, the New York Times has done a tremendous amount of reporting, and not just reporting, but editorializing about his convictions for sex crimes. And again, this is not to say that that's not important. It definitely is. But there's been very little, almost nil, in terms of corresponding efforts to answer that question, Faisal. Who was he to be able to do that? So that's what we hope that our reporting is going to do. And we're going to dig very deeply back, because in addition to the emails I mentioned we last week got a disclosure of another cache of emails, Epstein's emails from his Yahoo account, which go back to 2006, 2005 in some cases. We've done one story based on that already, but there's a lot more in there which kind of goes back into the story of who he was. And it doesn't tell the whole story necessarily. He was lived into almost his 70s. He was in the 60s, an older guy. But the last 2 decades of his life, at least, which were a very, very important, consequential era.
Well, that's what I hope we'll be talking more about on this podcast, about the way that these powerful networks seem to work below the surface. I want to bring Lynzy in at this point. I want to give the audience an understanding of some of the stories that you've been working on, and then we'll kind of circle back to how they affect the balance of power. I think Lynzy, when you were reporting, uncovering the story of the CIA-backed night raids in Afghanistan, I think the scale of the task that you were up against is something that perhaps the audience perhaps doesn't fully grasp. It took you 4 years from your first reporting trip to the publication of that story. So tell us, just give us an outline of what you uncovered, and then tell us the point at which you started to realize, okay, this is much bigger than I thought it was.
Yeah, it was a long slog, that one. I think from the very beginning when I started looking into it, it was really clear to me that I knew nothing about these units, these Afghan units that were armed, funded, and trained by the CIA. There really wasn't a lot on them beyond what Afghans had witnessed through their night raids and their operations. There wasn't a lot out there. And it was only over the course of years did I start to get just even basic information on how they functioned, how the operation worked, how the chain of command worked. And it was a very difficult story in the sense that everything was off the books. It was classified. So it wasn't one of those stories where you get a trove of documents and you can sift through them. And it was very much a door-knocking job. I was going around Eastern Afghanistan trying to track as many night raids as I could, and the civilian death toll from those night raids, from just one of 4 known zero units.
And just tell us, the zero units, I mean, now people may know the term because of this Afghan national who shot 2 officers in DC, but these were units that were run by the CIA, but they were ostensibly under the control of the Afghan government.
Yeah, they were Afghan Special Force units under the NDS, which was Afghan intelligence at the time. But they had the backing of the CIA, and they went on operations with American Special Forces at times as well. So this wasn't American military counterterrorism operations. This fell under the umbrella of intelligence operations. And they were going after targets that were deemed as a threat to the US, so Taliban, and in later years, ISIS also. But they were very secretive. Nobody really knew a lot about them and how the raids worked. And it was just a case of hearing from eyewitnesses, families of victims, and piecing together even the basics, what uniforms they wore, what trucks they drove, how intelligence was called in, how it was vetted, everything, pulling all of that together.
These night raids, the again, for people who've forgotten it, I mean, that's part of what we'll talk about, the way that there is this conscious act of forgetting these stories. But the night raids were these raids that Americans and Afghans conducted on various homes, and some of the people were taken away without justification and essentially disappeared.
Yeah, some of them disappeared. Some of them were deemed terrorists and turned out to be civilians later. Many of them were children. There's a whole bucket of people that we really struggled to identify. And even, I would say, we came up with a total of, in 4 years, 452 civilians from one of these units that were killed in these night raid operations. But that's just one of 4, but it's most certainly an undercount because there's so many that we just couldn't track. It's much easier if you have an airstrike to be able to track what happened and to measure the damage to infrastructure or to follow what weapons were used or what planes were used. It's very difficult in ground operations. They're much more secretive. Tracing the damage to homes afterwards and is very difficult. But Afghans, almost every Afghan has a mobile phone, and when you speak to them and they take videos of what happened and you go to the coroner's office afterwards and you photograph the bodies afterwards, you can put all these puzzle pieces together and show what these units with the backing of the US were doing over that time.
And I want to broaden this conversation because I think with you, I'm going to ask you this, Murtaza, in a moment about the Epstein files. But I mean, do you think, Lynzy, that when you started to get into it, you said there's just in one unit you found that there were 400 victims. Did you start to be surprised at how big this network was and how many people were eventually pulled into it?
I think it was more surprising about the lack of oversight and how people were getting away with it, more than that it was happening, because everybody knew that it was happening to some degree and people spoke about it. But Every Afghan that I spoke with, every family, honestly didn't think anyone in America cared, didn't think anyone was going to do anything about it. No one thought the story was going to do anything. So there's this lack of trust that anyone would really care about what was happening on the ground in Afghanistan, despite the evidence they had.
Murtaza, how much do you think that that is also what happened with Epstein? That just for the longest time, a lot of the people around Epstein, and no doubt Epstein himself, thought that nobody cares about this stuff. No one's interested in what we're doing because they knew it was illegal.
Yeah, I think especially with the sex trafficking, there's clearly a sense of instrumentalization of vulnerable people, and you see that in not just abuses took place in Florida, but also he was involved in trafficking women. It's not clear if they're underage or not, but certainly younger, impoverished women, Eastern Europe, around the world. That was something that's been documented later in his life as well too. And I do think there's a sense of impunity that was clearly reigning in his activities. And if you look at what he was doing for several decades, I think that the correct way of thinking about this, and to go back to kind of your theme about how power really operates and the world really operates, we think of the world in terms of states and institutions and so forth. And that's true. But there's another segment which is like this almost transnational organized crime segment, and it's not that they're always necessarily breaking the law per se, although they often are. It's just that there's a parastatal sort of institutions and networks of people who operate above and beyond these institutions. And they were involved. Like Epstein, it's not really a secret. We're going to write more about it later, but he was involved in like Iran-Contra and things like that. And, these other financial scandals that took place many, many years before his sex trafficking. So if you add up all those years of law breaking or de facto law breaking, or certainly, unethical behavior at bare minimum, and you compound that over years and years, certainly there would be a sense of impunity, and that impunity gives rise to greater abuses later on. And sometimes you can go too far and get caught, and that does happen here and there, and arguably happened in his case. But that is certainly a similar dynamic. And also when you think about the zero units, the whole idea that they were kind of trained and operated outside of control of the Afghan government, and they were not really part of any civilian oversight, and they were just looking at an implement of the CIA, which was above and beyond any sort of restraint that Afghans could impose upon them, even though in theory, the U.S. is supporting an Afghan government in that country. It's kind of similar in a way, because you have these other individuals who were not answerable to anybody and were able to do all these things, and then did tremendous harm, in fact, to many people.
I mean, do you think that a lot of the institutions of power, the structural power, thinks that it's very useful to tap into these networks because it is so difficult to unravel? I mean, these people are, for Epstein, but there's others, because they operate in this kind of transnational way. If they do something, it's not obvious under which jurisdiction people are going to start looking. And I wonder, and of course that applies to Afghanistan as well, but I wonder if that is actually part of the way that these power structures operate, that they seek to use people who are not part of the official power structures themselves, because it brings them a certain amount of deniability.
I think you just hit the nail on the head, because one thing that Epstein's basically his core competence was he was a money launderer. He was very good at money laundering at huge scale. And money laundering is a tool which is very useful to, if you think about it, people in intelligence agencies or militaries who would like to carry out operations and need funding for them, but do not want those operations to be part of any formal government budget, which would render them subject to oversight.
Right,
and again,
especially in democratic countries where there are actually budgets and people can see the line items.
Exactly. And if you look at something like Iran-Contra, the whole aspect of it was a black budget operation to do something that people really didn't want the civilian population or government to know about. So Epstein, someone like Epstein, and there are other people like him, like Adnan Khashoggi and other people who were his associates who knew him very well and who engaged in similar activities, they were people you could call upon to help provide funds and deniability for such operations. And that's a very useful tool whose utility does not really go away in any sense over time, because people still continue to need that. But if you look at the more recent activities way past Iran-Contra that we wrote about with Epstein, he was somebody who, he would kind of assist in making connections for states or individuals to conduct what's called track 2 diplomacy, second tier diplomacy, to help bring about political outcomes which are favorable. So, he continued to act in this role throughout his life. And he was somebody who, because he was not tied to any particular government, he in theory could be tied to all the governments. He had good ties with Putin, with Russian officials, Israeli officials, Americans, Gulf Arab states, very close with. Throughout Africa, he had good connections. So it was both the personal networks and what he may have used those for, and the leverage he may have had over people in those networks, but also just the connectivity and the fact that he could be used again as a plausibly deniable form of engagement, such that you don't have to call an Israeli diplomat to Moscow to have this discussion. You could have it with somebody who would be known to represent their interests or their perspective in some form, without having to acknowledge that.
I want to come to Lynzy to talk about the investigation a bit, but I just want to ask one more thing about this, because it's kind of amusing, but also it's kind of shocking that whenever we are talking about figures like Epstein, occasionally the ghosts of other people raise their heads. So you brought up Adnan Khashoggi. Some of us who were paying attention a few decades ago, we were like, oh, of course, that guy. I wonder what happened to that. And there's all these different figures and characters. You brought up Iran-Contra that suddenly reappear. It's kind of how the gray zone power works. Occasionally, it comes through. Occasionally there's a little glimpse, and I wanted to mention this little glimpse that we saw. Remember when they had the Gaza Peace Summit in Egypt, and there was that hot mic moment where the president of Indonesia, Prabowo Subianto, said to Donald Trump, hey, can I get a meeting with your son? And it was just a little glimpse that sometimes the power networks, this is one president talking to another. He doesn't need the son-in-law, I think his son-in-law, right, doesn't have an official position in the US government. He doesn't need to talk to the son-in-law. He can talk either to the president or anybody further down the chain in the official capacity. But he doesn't want to. We don't quite know why. Perhaps you know why. But he wants to because there's obviously some ulterior power network which is more important than the structured one.
Absolutely, there's no doubt about it, and that hot mic moment is very interesting because I think it was speculated that one of the reasons he wanted to talk to Trump's son was because he's involved in those business deals and so forth, and with the cryptocurrency and all these other things, moving money around and so forth. Epstein, one thing that we see from his emails, and again, this has not been discussed in any of the public reporting of him to date, but we've written a bit about it and we're going to do more. It's clear in his emails with Barack and others that one of his core competencies was making people a lot of money. Once they left public life, because in the U.S. and in UK and elsewhere, and apparently in Israel too, one of the very recurrent features of the political system is this revolving door between public and private life. And people, when they leave public office, they want to make a lot of money, banking on the connections and the notoriety they gained while in office. Epstein was like a fixer who'd help you do that. So in one email, Barack actually thanks him and says, thank you for your efforts in helping me make a lot of dough, quote unquote. He uses the word dough. And that Epstein was doing that. He was connecting him all around the world, connecting him to Peter Thiel and all these other rich people
there you
who work with him in various ways.
Another connector from the shadows.
Yeah, exactly. And to fund his contracts and help as a quote unquote consulting business get off the ground as soon as he left office. So, he was like someone who had that power. And those people who are there to make people a lot of money. And again, I would say it's a pretty small community of people. It's relatively, small community of people globally connected to one another. He was like an entree to that. I won't belabor this, but I'll make one small point. Like, people always ask about the blackmail issue with Epstein. I think that is a very plausible allegation, needs to be looked into more. But in a lot of ways, it seems like people were willing to do what he wanted anyways. A lot of people were willing to do what they wanted without blackmail because they want access to the money. They want access to the social network. They want access
social
to
network, absolutely.
The fun and the glamour of being associated with this guy and the financial reward. So that in itself is a very compelling form of influence he had, even without having to formally coerce anyone in any way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is something that has really come out in recent years, because obviously there was this period of time when just after Epstein was convicted of solicitation with a minor. It was kind of very serious. He went to jail, and a lot of people cut ties with him afterwards. What's really coming out is that quite a lot of powerful people, including in the UK, the parts of the monarchy, didn't cut ties with him. And so the question is always, well, why didn't you? Why did you stay at his house afterwards? And it's because these people are a very small number of them, and then they're still within the same social network. So they don't want to give up those ties. They don't want to lose the friendships, the parties, the connections.
That's completely right. And, it's funny because sometimes you see people who are in these sort of like rarefied elite worlds, and they're doing things which optically seem to be so, obviously wrong to the rest of us. But in that little world, it kind of makes sense. You see them as Jeffrey Epstein's an interesting person. So why wouldn't I meet with him? who exactly is the person who I'm supposed to hide this from? That was just the mentality. It's a very insular world. So yeah, I think that's what you saw up to the moment of his death. Really, these elite people continued to interact with him and see him as they were completely unbothered, let's say, by his documented sex trafficking convictions.
Lynzy, let's talk a bit about the aftermath of your investigations. You were uncovering something which is really at the very nexus of American power and its ability to operate across the world with impunity. Were you amazed at the levels to which the institutions went to suppress criticism?
Yeah, I think it was very difficult with the agencies that we had to go to and that I had to reach out to and kind of present my findings and say, well, what do you have to say about this? Does anyone in Congress care? These operations and Title 50 and all this complicated web that they fall under, agencies like the CIA are still accountable to congressional committees. But that really comes down to who's asking the right questions. Does anyone have the capacity or willpower to ask those questions? Do they care? And I think the kind of result of after 4 years of work and seeing how little they cared or just really, really trying to get a response on things was I'm not going to lie, it was a super depressing result from it, because there's such a separation between almost even just the American public in general and Afghanistan. And I always say, I don't know why Americans think Afghanistan's so far away when the two were so tightly tied over this.
Do you think that what sometimes happens, I mean, we talked briefly about this Afghan national who shot these two police officers in DC. Do you think that sometimes it takes a story like that to bring it home to a domestic audience?
Yeah, I think definitely. And the response from veterans was a really interesting one. And I'm talking Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan. America has a huge veteran population, right?
Sure.
And how they are treated by their government and the support that they're given. There's so much crossover. There was a huge response to the story, which was great. But you're up against agencies that will do everything in their willpower to not talk about issues like this, which is overall a lack of accountability, right?
Yeah. I mean, do you think that, I suppose these agencies assume that there never will be any blowback, like the DC incident, and they think that they can just keep stalling on these stories and the domestic audience is never really going to pay attention to it. And most of the time, frankly, they don't pay attention to it because it doesn't bubble its way into the surface. It's only when something like this, it's really shocking, suddenly happens that the words zero unit make their way into the public consciousness.
For sure. And I think, I've been working on a story since the last one published about the soldiers since they arrived in America. So what happened this last week in Washington just was something that I've been looking into for a long time, because I think one of the biggest concerns when these guys were flown out in August 2021 is like, what the hell is the U.S. going to do with these guys? What do you do with guys that you've trained up who have for years these are violent acts, right? They affect people. They are dropped in a new country without support. There's already all the issues of adapting to that. There's all the social stuff and pride stuff with getting a job and supporting your family and getting used to an American culture. And, people can pick on one thread or the other and talk about culture or society or religion. But overall, it's a care for a population. If they don't have that, what happens to guys, right? What purpose? I think anywhere in the world, every person will fall into a void in society if they don't have a purpose, right? That's why we see people join extremist groups in the first place, because for some reason, they're not supported or they don't have somewhere to turn. And so what happened this last week with the National Guard shooting is just a really tragic result of this America's what they were doing in Afghanistan spilling over, right?
The foreign wars coming home. I mean, I tend to look at it from the perspective of thinking, if you're an American citizen, the government is putting dangerous people in your midst. And there's a kind of inevitability that something is going to happen because, as you say, a lot of these people are deeply traumatized. And I mean, it's not an excuse, but when you have that number of people who have been through these committed these violent acts, if you just put them within a civilian population, at some point something ugly is going to happen.
For sure. But I think also the way we talk about when things happen in America, whether it's this or whether it's a different shooting, the kind of political swing on it. I mean, since Trump's campaign and how he spoke about like immigration and how he spoke about the Afghan community in general was almost like there's no half mass with how he was approaching this. When something like this happens, it's almost like a lightning rod in what was already this simmering debate and already this conversation, right? And you'll have people immediately jump to drawing everyone into one bucket and assuming I'm not safe. And I know a lot of Afghans in America right now who are worried that people don't trust them or are suspicious of them, and they don't want to catch a glance too long with someone because they're nervous someone's going to think they're
Something's happening,
be fearful of them. And that's the kind of separation you don't want, right? That's the dangerous side of like grouping or generalizing like this.
I wanted to ask a slightly meta question to both of you, which is that you've both worked on these stories where you're uncovering something that the governments don't want uncovered. And I wondered, when these stories are so big and so many people need to hear about it, but also so many people stand to lose from hearing about it, why is it the job of investigative journalists to do that? Why is it always that these individuals, working sometimes at small organizations, sometimes at big organizations, but why is it that these individuals have to bring to light what was happening with the collusion of the governments?
At least in the U.S. and the U.K. is different in some degree. There's a First Amendment, and there's like in theory, they're opening up the field for people to look into these things and discuss them and so forth and bring them to light. And that's the role of the press or even ordinary citizens and so forth to do that. The issue is that there are all these sophisticated mechanisms of censorship and surveillance and suppression of this information that people don't want to come out. So, for instance, the stories we're doing, they're all based on public information. There are emails which are on hacked emails, which are available. People can peruse through them and so forth. They've been there for a while. Dropside News is a very small organization. There's only like 7 of us. There's not really many full-time staff here at all. And we're the only ones really doing it. And I think it's because, I can only speculate, but there's like a political disincentive to doing it. And, they are like kind of complicated to go through them. So if there were other people or small organizations that had the political will, but they lacked the technical capacity to do it, that could be a barrier. So there's like a Venn diagram of people who ultimately are able to write about this. And we're one of the small group of people in that Venn diagram.
Small group.
Exactly.
I mean,
right.
You do have you say you're a small organization. You do have quite the reach. I was listening to an interview with John Mearsheimer the other day, and he was quoting you, actually. He was talking about you. So you have quite the reach. Let's just go back to this bit, Lynzy, about why it's the role of journalists to kind of uncover these things.
I think it's to do with, I was speaking with someone recently about how the idea of like a whistleblower has changed, right? And we used to think of a whistleblower in this like traditional sense of like someone whistleblowing national security interests or someone from inside an agency. I think of a whistleblower as someone in a village in Afghanistan who's been gathering evidence and the whole community of people who pull that together. And that's what journalists work off. And that's how we bring, I think, stories to light. And I think that it's beyond, and I just think you can't do that without it coming from the communities who are affected or the communities who have been wronged in the first place. And they're the ones who really, you can't do it without them first highlighting it. And so I view it as this kind of community whistleblowing effect, which journalists have the ability to pick up on, which other people don't, I think.
I want us to talk a bit about the illusion of accountability. I was thinking about this, Lynzy, when I was reading something in your reporting. There was a section in one of your pieces where you talk to a CIA spokesperson, and they're offering this blanket statement in response to your question, saying that, this is a quote, "The US takes extraordinary measures beyond those mandated by law to reduce civilian casualties in armed conflict and treats any claims of human rights abuses with the utmost seriousness." I can't even say the sentence without just kind of rushing my way through it, because it doesn't really have a great deal of content, linguistic content in it. But it strikes me that how polished these illusions of accountability have become. And I wonder, who are they for?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to bring up. And even you just reading that just is like so frustrating to me, because you could read that comment and it could be from something they'd said in 1980s in an article. Like, it has no context. It has no,
Absolutely.
It
could
doesn't
be about
mean anything.
any war. I mean, you said earlier about all the veterans from Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan. It could have been any of those wars.
Exactly. And I mean, I got frustrated with this story, with the night raid story in particular, because I was like, look, I have to go to these people, but I know that I have a tough job with getting them to speak, and like really not this robotic, bizarre way of interaction, right? And I was like, why do we do this as journalists? Why do we go to places and accept that kind of a comment as enough when we've given them findings of like hundreds of civilians killed, with evidence, with coordinates, with whatever? Like, why is it enough that we accept that from these agencies? And it's so frustrating, because it's almost like, I think, across the board, and I don't know if you both feel like this as well, but it's almost like the bar is so low that I don't know what it takes to shift that, to say, no, we demand more from our agencies in terms of oversight. I don't know.
Well, how do you interpret it? I mean, do you think that it is something that the public wants, that people want to believe this, that they kind of, it's important to them to believe on some level that they are living under this enlightened system of government, and that these blanket denials are just enough? They give them just enough plausible deniability to be able to turn their attention back to their daily life and say, okay, well, that's sorted out.
I think the agencies just don't think that they have to do anymore. They know that they can get away with it. And I think people have lost trust in them. I think in the last several years, the way that people are responding to the CIA in particular, even government officials, and what's going on inside their internally for them, there's a lot of problems, right? I think people just don't expect more. But I think the only way to do it is to really keep coming at them with, well, like, this is, especially now in an age where you have presidents telling people everything's fake news and don't believe media and don't trust journalists. You're really up against it. So I'm like, keep a high bar, deliver really strong journalism with facts, and take it to them every single time, because I give people more credit that they really do read journalism, and they have a good, smart brain between their ears to work out what's what,
Well, Murtaza, how do you feel about that? I mean, I wonder, do you think that these illusions of accountability really matter to the public?
Yeah, there's a quote that hypocrisy is like the due that vice pays to virtue. So I think it's kind of like the hypocritical expression of concern about all these things, which I think no one really believes in some way, is also what they feel they have to do, and what they have to do to maintain I think what you described basically is correct, is a pretense or fig leaf of the existence of this very upright system that people wanted, and they actually not just wanted, the people uphold, it continues to exist. So, I don't know. I think that the issue is that in the last couple years, or maybe the last 10, 15 years especially, these institutions have lost control of information in a way. Yeah, so when there were a few centralized nodes of disseminating information, they can maintain a much more plausible semblance that their claims and their narrative of what they're doing and so forth are accurate. But, when you have all these leaks and you have websites and channels and you cannot control the flow of information which contravenes that, at some point it reaches a critical mass. And that's why I think you see this bleeding away of trust in institutions, such that, the statement that they gave Lynzy, it's certainly, it's not very compelling to anyone who's read her reporting. And obviously something's going on here. It's a very boilerplate sort of attempt to do damage control, not very convincing in any way. That may have worked, before, but now it just doesn't really seem to work anymore because of the fact that there is this abundance of information which is outside their control. It may have worked before, but it's no longer an effective means of shoring up their position.
But do you think that the public needs that plausible deniability as well? That the language that comes from these institutions is partly formulated to give enough plausible deniability to the public so that the public can maintain this idea in their imagination that there is an enlightened system of government and that, it's our people and they would never do such a thing, those sorts of things?
I think undoubtedly, because when you talk to a lot of people about this who maybe don't follow the subject as closely, not universally, but a lot of people, they do tend to revert back to these statements as their narrative of what's going on, or a rebuttal.
Ordinary people.
Ordinary people, yeah. It does have a purchase, actually. So
do you find that, Lynzy, that ordinary people will say, well, I don't think my government would do that, and you go, yeah, they would. I've been to the villages.
I think that, and my experience is individuals are much more mistrustful of their government than that. Yeah.
I'm very interested in this idea of collective forgetting, which is something that I think it applies to the work we've been talking about with Afghanistan, but also, of course, with Epstein. There was a section in one of your essays about the night raids, Lynzy, where you write that it became clear that the language of the intelligence world itself could hide its weaknesses. You quote Lisa Ling, a military veteran who built technology that was used in the night raids, said that when intelligence officers cite multiple sources of intelligence to justify an operation, meaning the night raids in which they killed civilians, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have confirmation. It could just mean that they have the overhead image of a house and then an informant telling them who's inside, and they make that seem as if it is a more plausible source of information than it might actually be.
Yeah, it's very interesting because speaking with people who are involved in that tech side, SIGINT side, human, how it was all gathered, how they built these targeting packages. Speaking with these people, it just made it sound so simplified, and you're like, really? That's all you're doing? You're looking into people's houses, you're seeing a big gathering and you think it's a bomb factory. You're seeing two guys with turbans on a motorbike and you think they're Talib. Like, it's not like it's a little bit scary how simplified it was what they were working with. And when you have people working with that tech for so long saying the reality at the end of the US's war in Afghanistan is we never understood Afghanistan, which we knew. America never understood Afghanistan. They didn't know who they were looking for. That's scary because that's what's being used in every country. There's a pattern to how the US targets people and how they discriminate, or not discriminate, but like separate who's a civilian from who's a target, right? That is the fundamentals of why all of this happened. And when it's literally a guy who doesn't know what he's looking at and doesn't know what he's looking for and is surprised at the result.
I know I've come back to this topic a few times on the podcast, but it is something, Murtaza, that I'm endlessly intrigued by, because whenever, and it's not just the US that does this, but obviously the US is one of the main actors in these foreign wars, but whenever a country in the West does it, they'll carry out all of these crimes in a particular country, Afghanistan, Iraq, wherever, and then they will say after it's all over, I guess we just didn't know enough about the country. I just say, yeah. And it strikes me as a kind of odd mea culpa, because there's no downside to saying that. You don't get hauled up before a court of law. People just nod along and go, I guess you just sort of have to learn more about the country next time, about Syria, about Yemen, about Sudan. It goes on forever.
Yeah, one thing that was very notable at the start of the war on terror, especially during the Iraq war, that there was a tremendous lack of language proficiency in U.S. institutions, military, intelligence agencies, FBI, and so forth. People just couldn't speak the languages. They couldn't speak Arabic, for instance. People who were able to speak Arabic really shot up the ranks immediately in the FBI, for instance, because no one else could speak these terrorist suspects. In Afghanistan, it seemed like people were not aware of the ethnic mix of the country as well, too, or the fact that there were these ethnic divisions and so forth. It just completely evaded people's knowledge at the time. And, I think institutionally, there was some improvement over 2 decades, a little bit at least. It's much far too late and far too little, given everything that happened in the intervening period. At the end of the Afghan war in 2021, when it was collapsing, a lot of these questions were being relitigated in the public fresh, as though no one ever really figured it out. And even today, they don't really know much about it. So when this happened in DC, the shooting, yeah, I knew what the Zero Units was because I've interviewed people whose family members were killed by Zero Units. I've read Lynzy's reporting as well, too. But it was being reported as though it's a completely new phenomenon and no one had heard of this in the American public. So that's why, it's interesting. You talk to different segments of society, and I guess that maybe when I talk to people who have read my reporting, other people's reporting, who are politically engaged in some sense, they may have a bit more sophisticated view of things, or they be more cynical or something like that. But a lot of people, at least in the United States, they are kind of aloof to all these things entirely. And when something does happen, when rarely in correspondence to how much damage the U.S. did in Afghanistan, the very relatively small, tragic and awful, but relatively minor in comparison blowback which took place in the U.S. from that, when it bumbles up, people are very shocked. They have no way of contextualizing it. And then they start blaming all Afghans or making it a racial issue or a sectarian issue or so forth. Because the fact that really, despite all these decades of involvement, very intimate involvement in Afghanistan, the actual understanding of the place and what the U.S. did there and what happened and who the Afghans were has not permeated the broader society really much at all.
This is what I mean about collective forgetting. There is this deliberate amnesia about what happened in these wars. I mean, people will talk about these wars as if they were so long ago, as if it was something that happened maybe at the end of the last century, when, it was just a few years ago. It's kind of astonishing that the wars happen and people just move on from it and then they forget about it. And yeah, I find that collective forgetting so interesting, but also so upsetting. I really want us to make sure, Lynzy, that we talk about your Syria story, because I think it's very interesting. This was a piece that you published just a few months ago in The Observer about how an Austrian NGO was complicit in abducting Syrian children from their parents in collaboration with the regime of Bashar al-Assad. And you wrote in the report that for years the Austria-based leadership knew about the unlawful transfers and abuse and stayed silent because they didn't think anyone would ever find out until the regime fell. It's astonishing that these sorts of things happen in full view of the world with institutions that are known, that are globally known.
It's completely bizarre. The first time I went back a couple of days after the Assad regime fell, and this Austrian NGO had made this really odd Instagram post about receiving children from Syrian intelligence. And I was like, this is odd. And then I looked up who they were. This is the biggest NGO working with children without parents in the world, in 136 countries. And multiple abuses publicly reported by themselves in the past. Everything from sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, rape from staff members. These are coming out in their public reports, and they are just functioning in countries. And I was like, this is crazy to me that we live in a world where you have an NGO that is still able to operate, that still partners with UNICEF and the UN and falls under all these childcare protective policies. And this is what they're doing. So then, the story was about really what happened in Syria over the years with them, which obviously only came out after the fall. And now they're, I think, doing some serious damage control.
This story actually came about because the charity itself admitted it, although I think they didn't quite realize what they were admitting to. They put it on their Instagram page that they were cooperating with the Assad regime. And I think they just assumed that admission would never come back.
Exactly. And this is after they had plastered photos of Asma Assad with kids and all the connections that the Assad family had deeply into Syria, and also international actors who were working in Syria at the time, which is a whole other conversation. But yeah.
Let's end on this, because I think it's been a really interesting conversation about the way that power works and how hard it is to drag these things out of the shadows and into the light. Both of you have worked extensively on things that powerful countries want to keep hidden. And I imagine that that has also taken a toll in some way on your own personal life. It must affect the way you look at the world, the way that you conceive of what is happening around you. I want to start perhaps with Lynzy and then Murtaza. Had you recognized that interpretation of how it might have affected you personally?
Probably, but I'm probably really bad at seeing seeing that myself. I choose stories, and maybe Murtaza feels the same with me with this, but like I choose stories out of outrage. I choose what I'm gonna pitch someone as a freelancer because I'm like, this is so outrageous to me. This is absolutely bizarre. I have to look at this. And it's really sad that that's kind of the starting point, maybe, of
Yeah, but does it affect the way that you think about, I mean, governments, your own governments, the people that you live among? I mean, surely after you find out what people have done in the shadows of Afghan villages, you must feel differently about people that you know who've served in the military, because you must wonder, well, I wonder what you did.
Yeah, for sure. But I think one thing that I do always try and do is, like, for example, when it came to Afghanistan, there's a lot about the US military that angers me a lot, right? But I have learned the most from having conversations with American veterans and Afghan veterans. And I am always telling myself that I need to have conversations with people and read stories from places that I don't naturally gravitate to. And when I speak to people that I'm not naturally gravitate to or have an uncomfortable conversation, that really brings out a lot of things that I need to be more open to. And I don't want to sound like cliche about it, but it is really bizarre what can come out of forcing yourself into something that might be a little bit uncomfortable like that.
And that's part of the story. I think you mentioned it earlier as well. Like, a lot of the people who are most angry about what the US is doing are serving or former service members, because they believe in the institution of the military, and they're very angry at what people have done in its name.
Absolutely, yeah.
Murtaza, let's end on you. Well, how have you been affected by this endless search for the way that power is hiding itself?
Yeah, I guess I am also not super introspective about this. Maybe one day, 30 years from now, it'll all hit me in a very galling way. But I guess, it is interesting working on some of these stories about, for instance, Epstein and the way that these networks have operated. It kind of feels like a little bit like the Matrix or something, because it feels like you're tapping into something which is very real and very visceral. And, it sounds like a conspiracy. The entire Epstein story sounds like a conspiracy, and it is a conspiracy. It's just that our word for conspiracy is really just the activities of powerful people which are not transparent, or not working in conjunction with one another, were not transparent, not covered by the media or addressed by the public. So in that light, there are a lot of conspiracies out there which exist, which, the conspiracy is like the default mode of some people, the way they operate. So, it does give you a different understanding of events. And then now when I read the news, actually, it's interesting because I can sort of tell when something is being concocted or ginned up to distract from something else a little bit. So, but
do you think that I wonder? I find this really interesting with investigative journalists, that how much it affects you on a day-to-day level. Like, once you start to realize how the power structures actually operate, does it not start to bother you, and you can't really read the news any longer?
Yeah. Well, you can read it just to see what they're saying, but then a lot of times missing the point. And to kind of address it to the Epstein issue, again, like, there are two aspects of the story, or multiple aspects of the story. One aspect is definitely the sex trafficking, and that's, the New York Times has covered that, ad nauseum. They have almost daily op-eds and news stories about this, things we already know, but just talking about from different angles again and again and again. And as of this recording, at least, absolutely no acknowledgement of what we've been reporting on, which is the intelligence operations that he was involved in, and the back channel diplomacy and the funding of cyber weapon projects and all these things, which are very consequential. So it's sort of an alternate sort of version of history which you're able to access and look at. And to the extent people are becoming more cynical and just being more open to hearing about it, I think it's good, because, it does kind of change the way you look at things, and inevitably makes you more cynical or a little more skeptical of things than you would have been prior if you just take things for granted.
You've been listening to The Lead from New Lines Magazine. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.